The morning of November 19th, 1942, arrived without fanfare across the frozen steppes northwest of Stalingrad. The sky hung low and gray like a shroud stretched tight across the world. Private Klaus Weber stood in his foxhole at 10 minutes past 7, his breath forming clouds that vanished into the bitter air, watching the eastern horizon with the dull resignation of a man who had learned not to hope for anything beyond survival through the next hour. He was 19 years old, though the 8 months he had spent on the Eastern Front had carved lines into his face that made him look older. He came from Munich, from a small bakery on a cobblestone street where his father kneaded dough before dawn every morning and where the smell of fresh bread filled their apartment above the shop. That world felt impossibly distant now, separated from this frozen wasteland not just by miles but by some fundamental transformation in the nature of reality itself. The boy who had left Munich in March was dead. The thing that remained was harder, thinner, more capable of enduring what should not be endured. Weber had been assigned to the 3rd Romanian Army as a liaison officer, which was the polite military term for watchdog. His actual orders were explicit and ugly in their clarity. He was to prevent the Romanian soldiers from retreating without authorization. He was to stiffen their resolve. He was to shoot anyone who ran if circumstances demanded it. The German High Command had positioned Romanian forces along the critical northern shoulder of the salient, stretching to Stalingrad, not despite their weakness, but because of it. German soldiers were needed for the street fighting in the city. The Romanians were expendable in the arithmetic of strategic planning. Weber understood this. The Romanians understood it too. They could see it in their equipment. Obsolete weapons from another era. Anti-tank guns that might scratch the paint on a Soviet T-34, but would not stop it. They could feel it in how German officers spoke to them, with the dismissive courtesy reserved for tools that would be discarded when broken. They knew they were holding this position because someone had to hold it and because German lives were considered more valuable than theirs. But Weber was not alone in his foxhole. He had not been alone for 8 months. War strips away everything eventually, all the comfortable lies and self-deceptions, all the ideology and propaganda, until what remains is the oldest and simplest truth that soldiers have always known. You do not fight for abstract causes. You fight for the men beside you. You fight to keep them alive and to stay alive yourself. Everything else is decoration. Feldwebel Ernst Kruger sat 3 meters to Weber's left, a solid man of 34, with the weathered face and powerful hands of someone who had spent his life working underground. Kruger had been a miner in the Ruhr before the war, going down into darkness every morning and coming back up every evening, knowing that each descent might be his last. That experience had taught him things that officers learned only in staff colleges. He understood how structures failed. He knew how to read terrain and calculate risk. He possessed the particular wisdom of men who have faced death as a daily occupational hazard rather than as an abstraction discussed in briefings. Kruger had been with Weber since April. He was the squad leader, the father figure, the man whose judgment the others trusted more than they trusted their own. He rarely raised his voice. He did not need to. When Kruger spoke, men listened because they had learned that his words carried weight earned through competence rather than rank. To Weber's right lay Gefreiter Otto Schmidt, 22 years old, a philosophy student from Berlin who had volunteered in 1941 with his head full of Nietzsche and Wagner, believing he was marching into history. The Eastern Front had educated him thoroughly in the difference between philosophical abstractions about struggle and the concrete reality of frozen mud and empty bellies, and watching friends die for reasons that made no sense. Schmidt still read when he could find books. He still asked questions about meaning and purpose. But the questions had changed character. They had become harder and more urgent and less likely to have satisfying answers. The 4th member of their group was Schütze Hans Becker, a 27-year-old farmer from Bavaria who spoke rarely but worked steadily and never complained. Becker had a wife named Anna and 2 small children he had not seen since the previous winter. He carried their photograph in a leather wallet pressed against his heart. Sometimes at night, Weber would catch Becker staring at that photograph in the light of whatever fire they had managed to build, his face absolutely still, and Weber would look away because that kind of longing was private and should not be witnessed. These 3 men were Weber's world now, his squad. his brothers in the peculiar kinship forged by shared danger. They had fought together through the summer offensive, through the approach to Stalingrad, through the grinding urban combat that had consumed German and Soviet forces in equal measure. They had learned each other's habits and capabilities. They knew who could be trusted with which tasks, who needed encouragement and who needed space, how to function as a single organism with four bodies. 2 weeks earlier, Kruger had gathered them in the relative privacy of a destroyed farmhouse and spoken with unusual directness. He had been reviewing intelligence reports, talking to officers who would speak honestly rather than repeating comfortable propaganda. What he learned had troubled him enough to break the unofficial rule against discussing strategic matters with enlisted men. The Soviets were building up forces, Kruger told them, substantial forces north and south of their position, the kind of buildup that preceded major operations. The Romanian units holding the flanks were weak, under-equipped, demoralized. If the Soviets attacked in strength, if they hit the Romanians rather than the German positions further east, the line would collapse. Anyone could see it. Anyone who looked at the dispositions with clear eyes understood what was coming. Kruger had filed reports. He had walked up the chain of command as far as a Feldwebel could walk, trying to make someone listen. The officers had dismissed his concerns with the particular arrogance of men who have never been wrong because they have never been in a position where being wrong carries consequences they personally must face. The Soviets were finished, the officers said. They had been beaten in 1941, beaten again in 1942. They lacked the capacity for coordinated offensives. The intelligence suggesting otherwise was exaggerated or fabricated. German forces were superior in training, equipment, and fighting spirit. There was nothing to worry about. Kruger had returned to the squad and told them what the officers would not say. If the Soviets attacked here, if they broke through the Romanian positions, the German forces further east would be cut off, encircled. And if that happened, if they found themselves trapped, the only order that would matter was the oldest order soldiers have ever followed. Stick together. Move fast. Survive as a unit or die as a unit. Nothing else would count. Weber had asked whether Kruger thought the Soviets would actually attack. Kruger had looked at him with the patient expression of a teacher explaining something obvious to a slow student. Of course they would attack. This was the weakest point in the German line. Any competent commander could see it. The only question was when. That conversation had taken place 14 days ago. Since then, the squad had made quiet preparations. They had cached extra ammunition in locations they could reach quickly. They had identified escape routes eastward toward the main German positions. They had discussed, without stating explicitly, what they would do if official orders contradicted their survival instincts. They had become a conspiracy of four, bound by the understanding that they trusted each other more than they trusted the judgment of men who would not share the consequences of being wrong. Now, standing in his foxhole in the peculiar quiet of this November morning, Weber felt the weight of that conspiracy pressing against his chest like a physical presence. Something was wrong with the silence. It was too complete, too expectant. Even the wind had died. The air itself seemed to be holding its breath. He glanced at Kruger. The older man was scanning the horizon with the focused intensity of someone reading a text written in a language only he understood. After a long moment, Kruger turned his head and met Weber's eyes. He did not say anything. He did not need to. The look communicated everything. It was 7:17 in the morning when Weber noticed the Romanian soldiers in the positions around them beginning to show signs of nervousness. Small movements, adjustments of equipment, the body language of men who sensed danger without being able to identify its source. A corporal 20 meters away kept checking his watch, then scanning the western horizon, then checking his watch again. Schmidt noticed it too. The philosophy student leaned close to Weber and spoke quietly. "What do you think it means?" Weber did not answer because at 7:20 exactly, the answer announced itself with a violence that made thought impossible. The Soviet artillery barrage began without warning, thousands of guns opening fire simultaneously along a front stretching more than 100 kilometers. The sound was not individual explosions, but a continuous roar that obliterated all other sensory input. The earth convulsed. The sky disappeared behind smoke and dust and the hot wind of displaced air. The very substance of reality seemed to be coming apart under the hammer blows of high explosive. Weber threw himself into the bottom of his foxhole and pressed his face into frozen mud that smelled of metal and decay. Around him, Romanian positions were being systematically destroyed. He could not see it, but he could feel it through the ground itself. The impacts traveling through earth and stone like the footsteps of some incomprehensibly massive creature. Dugouts collapsed, burying men alive. Direct hits erased entire squads in bursts of flame and pressure. Shrapnel sang through the air like a million steel hornets, searching for flesh. The barrage lasted 80 minutes. Weber counted them off in his head, using the meditation technique Kruger had taught him, separating himself from his body and observing the situation as though watching someone else endure it. This was survival, not heroism or courage, or any of the qualities praised in propaganda. Just the animal reflex to make yourself small and still and hope the next shell landed somewhere else. When the barrage finally lifted, when the last echoes rolled away across the frozen steppe and left behind a ringing silence more terrible than the noise had been, Weber raised his head slowly and looked out across a landscape transformed into something from medieval visions of hell. The Romanian positions had been obliterated. Where there had been trenches and dugouts and fighting positions, there was now only cratered, smoking earth. Bodies and parts of bodies littered the snow. Entire sections of the defensive line had simply disappeared, and through the smoke came the sound that German soldiers on the Eastern Front had learned to fear above all others. The grinding mechanical roar of tank engines, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, an avalanche of Soviet armor advancing in waves that seemed to have no end. Kruger was already moving, his voice cutting through the shock with the calm authority of someone who had expected exactly this and had planned accordingly. Time to move. Grab essential gear only. We go east fast. Stay together. No heroes. Weber grabbed his rifle and the canvas bag with his personal items, the photograph of his family, the letters from home, and wrapped in waxed paper at the bottom of the bag, the promise he had made to a dying man 2 weeks earlier. Lieutenant Anton Lupescu had been a Romanian officer, a school teacher from Bucharest who had never wanted to be a soldier. He had treated Weber with courtesy and had shared what little food he had when rations ran short. They had played chess on a board scratched into a flat stone, passing cold evenings in the fiction of civilized behavior. Lupescu had shown Weber photographs of his wife Elena and his 5-year-old son Mihai. He had talked about returning to his classroom after the war, about teaching history to children who would inherit whatever world emerged from this catastrophe. 3 days before the Soviet offensive, Lupescu had pressed an envelope into Weber's hands. "If something happens to me," he had said, "if you survive and I do not, will you see that this reaches my family?" Weber had promised. "Of course, I swear it." The words had come easily because promising something did not seem like accepting that the promise might actually need to be kept. Now climbing out of his foxhole with Soviet tanks approaching through the smoke, Weber felt the envelope in his pocket like a burning coal. The weight of a promise made casually, but which circumstances had transformed into something far heavier. The squad moved east through chaos. Around them, Romanian soldiers were breaking, throwing down their weapons and running or standing frozen in shock or dying where they stood as Soviet tanks rolled over their positions. There was no shame in the rout, because there was nothing else to do. The Romanian forces had been positioned here to absorb the first impact of a Soviet offensive. They had absorbed it. Now they were being destroyed in detail while German forces further east tried to organize some kind of defensive response. Weber ran. They all ran. Even Kruger, who preached discipline and control, understood that this situation offered no alternative. Soviet tanks were firing at fleeing soldiers, their machine guns cutting down men who had already surrendered any pretense of resistance. Soviet infantry followed behind the armor, shooting anyone they found, taking few prisoners. Weber ran until his lungs burned and his legs threatened to give out. He ran past burning vehicles and dead men and wounded men calling for help he could not provide. He ran because stopping meant dying, and he was not ready to die. Not yet. Not when he still carried promises that needed keeping. They found cover in a shell crater and lay panting in the frozen mud while Soviet tanks rumbled past 50 meters away. Becker had been hit, shrapnel in his left leg, not deep but bleeding steadily. Schmidt tore strips from his own shirt to make a bandage, working with the focused intensity of someone who cannot afford to think about what will happen if they fail. Kruger counted them. 4 men, all present, all alive. He nodded once, satisfaction and relief mixed together in that single gesture. Then he pulled out a map and oriented it by landmarks that had survived the barrage. They were 3 kilometers west of where they needed to be. Between them, in the main German positions, lay Soviet armor and a landscape stripped of cover. "We move after dark," Kruger said. "Until then, we stay still and quiet. Conserve energy, tend the wounded, prepare for a long walk." They spent the day in that shell crater, listening to the sounds of the offensive rolling east like a storm front. More artillery, the crump of tank guns, the distant chatter of machine guns. Sometimes they heard screaming, but they tried not to listen to that. Listening to the screaming did not help anyone. In the afternoon, Weber saw it happen. Lieutenant Lupescu's position was 200 meters away, visible across the cratered ground. Soviet tanks had bypassed it initially, but now a single T-34 was returning, hunting for targets that had been missed in the first wave. The tank approached Lupescu's dugout methodically, its commander visible in the open hatch, scanning for threats. Weber wanted to look away but could not. He watched as the tank stopped directly above the dugout. He watched as Lupescu and 3 of his men emerged with their hands raised, surrendering, hoping for mercy, or at least for survival. The tank commander looked down at them for a long moment. Then the tank's machine gun opened fire. At that range, it lasted perhaps 5 seconds. When it stopped, 4 men lay in the snow, and the tank was already moving toward its next target. Weber closed his eyes, but the image remained, printed on the inside of his eyelids with perfect clarity. The envelope in his pocket suddenly felt impossibly heavy. He had promised to deliver it if Lupescu did not survive. Lupescu had not survived. Therefore, the promise stood. The logic was simple and inescapable. But how do you keep a promise when you are trapped behind Soviet lines with your own survival in doubt? How do you honor a dead man's request when honoring it might require surviving a catastrophe that showed no signs of allowing anyone to survive? Weber opened his eyes and found Kruger watching him. The older man's face showed understanding without pity. "We all carry debts," Kruger said quietly. "The trick is staying alive long enough to pay them." As darkness fell, they moved east, slowly, carefully, stopping frequently to listen and observe. The Soviet offensive had created chaos that could be used as camouflage. Units were confused, positions fluid, command and control degraded. In that chaos, 4 German soldiers could move through gaps that would not exist under normal circumstances. They walked through a nightmare landscape. Burning vehicles cast flickering orange light across snow, turned black with smoke and blood. Dead men lay in positions that suggested they had been alive one moment and erased the next. Equipment lay scattered everywhere. Rifles and helmets and gas masks and all the debris of military force suddenly rendered irrelevant by velocity and violence. At one point they passed a destroyed Soviet tank, its crew burned beyond recognition. Schmidt paused to look at it, his philosopher's mind unable to resist examining evidence of mortality. Kruger grabbed his arm and pulled him forward. "Don't stop. Don't look. Don't think. Just walk." They found German positions near midnight, an improvised defensive line where units from various formations had gathered, trying to make sense of what had happened, trying to organize some response to the catastrophe unfolding around them. Officers shouted contradictory orders. Men dug frantically at frozen earth, trying to create positions that might withstand the next attack. The air smelled of cordite in fear. A captain grabbed Kruger and demanded a report. Kruger delivered it with the flat precision of someone describing facts rather than participating in them. Romanian Third Army had been destroyed. A gap more than 50 kilometers wide had been torn in the line. Soviet armor was pouring through it, driving east and south. The offensive was coordinated and massive and showed no signs of stopping. The captain listened with his face gradually emptying of expression. When Kruger finished, the captain simply walked away without dismissing them. They watched him go and understood. The captain had just realized that the strategic situation had moved beyond anything his training had prepared him to handle. He was not walking away from them. He was walking away from responsibility for decisions he was not qualified to make. The squad found a corner of a basement in a destroyed farmhouse and settled in to wait for dawn. They shared what food they had, bread as hard as wood and cheese that tasted of mold. Becker's leg wound had stopped bleeding, but he was pale and weak. Schmidt cleaned it again, with water melted from snow, and applied fresh bandages torn from a dead soldier's shirt. Weber sat with his back against cold stone and felt the envelope in his pocket. He pulled it out and looked at it in the dim light of their one candle. The paper was heavy, expensive. Lupescu's wife's name and address in Bucharest, written in careful script. Inside, words from a dead man to a woman who did not yet know she was a widow. Promises and apologies and love expressed in ink that would outlast the flesh that had held the pen. Kruger noticed him holding it. "What is that?" "A promise," Weber said, "to a Romanian officer. He asked me to get this to his family if he died." Kruger considered this information in silence. Then he nodded slowly. "Keep it safe. We do not know what happens next. But if you survive, keep that promise." Promises are what separate us from animals. The next morning brought news that made the previous day's disaster seem like a prelude rather than a conclusion. The Soviet offensive had expanded. A second axis of attack had opened south of Stalingrad, hitting the Romanian Fourth Army with the same overwhelming force that had destroyed the Third Army. The southern Romanian forces were collapsing just as completely as the northern forces had. Two massive Soviet pincers were driving toward each other, one from the north and one from the south, aiming to meet somewhere west of Stalingrad. If they met, if the encirclement closed, the entire German Sixth Army would be trapped. 300,000 men cut off from supply and reinforcement. It would be the largest encirclement in military history. Throughout November 20th, the squad watched officers trying to organize counterattacks, trying to close the gap, trying to do something that would prevent the obvious catastrophe from materializing. Units were thrown forward in desperate attempts to slow the Soviet advance. Most of those units were never seen again. The squad was attached to a battle group cobbled together from remnants of various formations. A colonel whose name Weber never learned gave them orders to attack Soviet positions 5 kilometers west. The objective was to disrupt enemy supply lines and buy time for German forces to consolidate. Kruger listened to these orders with the expressionless face of a man hearing his own death sentence read aloud. When the colonel finished and strode away to deliver the same orders to other units, Kruger gathered the squad and spoke quietly. "The orders are suicide. We are outnumbered at least 5-1. We have no artillery support, no armor support, minimal ammunition. If we attack as ordered, we will achieve nothing and die doing it." Schmidt's face showed the strain of reconciling what he had been taught about duty with what his eyes told him about reality. "Are you saying we should refuse orders?" Kruger shook his head. "I am saying we obey orders, but we obey them intelligently. We attack, but we attack in a way that gives us a chance of surviving. We use cover, we advance when we can and hold when we cannot. We look for opportunities to inflict damage without exposing ourselves needlessly. We fight as soldiers, not as martyrs. And if the situation becomes hopeless, we withdraw in good order, rather than dying in place." He looked at each of them in turn, making sure they understood. No heroes, no martyrs. We are professionals. We complete the mission if possible, but we survive if at all possible. Agreed? They agreed. What choice did they have? The alternative was following orders blindly into annihilation, and none of them had survived 8 months on the Eastern Front by following orders blindly. The attack went as well as could be expected, which is to say it was a disaster mitigated only slightly by Kruger's tactical competence. They advanced through frozen fields under Soviet artillery fire. They engaged Soviet infantry positions from cover when possible, and withdrew when engagement meant certain death. They inflicted some casualties and delayed a Soviet supply column for perhaps 2 hours. Then the Soviet counterattack forced them back to their starting positions, with Becker taking a second wound, this time in the shoulder, and Otto collecting shrapnel in his thigh. They returned as night fell to find that the situation had deteriorated further. Soviet forces had advanced another 20 kilometers. The two pincers were now less than 40 kilometers apart. Officers spoke in hushed voices about encirclement, about being cut off, about the possibility that the entire Sixth Army might be trapped. On November 23rd, the trap closed. Soviet tank units from the northern and southern pincers met near the town of Kalak on the Don River, approximately 40 kilometers west of Stalingrad. Tank crews from both spearheads shook hands and celebrated while their commanders radioed Moscow with news of successful encirclement. And among those celebrating was Captain Dmitry Volkov, a 28-year-old tank commander who had survived Stalin's purges in 1937 by remaining invisible and competent. Volkov had an 8-year-old daughter named Katya waiting in Moscow, and everything he did, every order he followed, every battle he fought, was motivated by the determination that she would grow up in a world without fascist occupation. Volkov had led his T-34 through the breakthrough on November 19th, had seen the Romanian positions collapse, had driven deep into German rear areas where supply columns and headquarters units were caught completely unprepared. He had respected the courage of some Romanian units that fought to the death rather than surrender. He had felt conflicted about the slaughter, thinking that these soldiers were someone's sons and brothers, but understanding that they had invaded Soviet soil and must be driven out regardless of the cost. Now, with the encirclement complete, Volkov understood that the hard part was beginning. His battalion would spend the winter defending the ring against German attempts to break out or to be rescued. Men would die in the cold. Both sides would suffer, but it had to be done. For Katya, for all the children who deserved to grow up without knowing war. The German 6th Army, approximately 300,000 men, including attached Romanian and Croatian units, was surrounded. They occupied a pocket measuring roughly 50 kilometers east to west and 40 kilometers north to south, centered on the ruins of Stalingrad. They had supplies for perhaps 1 week if rationed carefully. They had no clear escape route because Soviet forces controlled all the roads and river crossings, and winter was coming, the real Russian winter that turned the steppe into a frozen wasteland where men died simply from being outside. Weber learned about the encirclement from a lieutenant who looked like he had aged 10 years in the past 4 days. The lieutenant gathered all available men and delivered the news with the mechanical precision of someone reciting words that had lost all meaning through repetition. We are cut off. Soviet forces have completed an encirclement. All routes to the west are blocked. We are to hold our positions and await relief. Luftwaffe will supply us by air until German forces outside the pocket can break through to restore contact. Rations are being cut to conserve supplies. All non-essential movement is prohibited. After the lieutenant finished and walked away, the squad sat in silence and processed what they had just been told. Kruger broke the silence first, his voice carrying the flat certainty of a man stating obvious facts. We are trapped, 300,000 of us. The Luftwaffe cannot possibly supply an encircled army through winter. Relief forces will try to break through, but success is unlikely. We are going to die here unless something changes dramatically. Becker spoke up, his voice weak from pain and blood loss. What do we do? Kruger looked at him, at Schmidt, at Weber. What he saw in their faces seemed to answer some question he had been asking himself. We do what soldiers have always done when trapped. We ration what we have. We share everything equally. We trust each other. We survive together or we die together. No other way makes sense. He pulled out what food he had left. Half a loaf of bread, hard as stone. A small piece of cheese. He divided it into 4 equal portions and handed them around. This is our new reality. We are brothers now in ways that matter more than blood. We look after each other. We keep each other alive. And if we die knowing we did everything possible to prevent it. Weber took his portion and ate slowly, making it last. The bread tasted of sawdust and mold, but he chewed it thoroughly and swallowed it gratefully. Around them, other soldiers were beginning to understand what the encirclement meant. Some wept, some prayed, some stared into space with eyes that had stopped processing what they saw. Weber reached into his pocket and felt Lupescu's envelope. The promise he had made suddenly seemed impossible to keep. How do you deliver a letter when you are trapped in a pocket 40 kilometers from the nearest friendly forces? How do you honor a dead man's request when you yourself are likely to die in this frozen wasteland? But even as he thought these things, Weber knew the answer. You keep the promise because keeping promises is what separates soldiers from savages. You carry the letter until you can deliver it, or until you die trying. You do not abandon obligations simply because circumstances make them difficult. That is what Kruger meant about brotherhood. That is what it means to remain human when everything around you is designed to strip away humanity. Night fell across the encircled pocket. Somewhere in the darkness, 300,000 men were beginning to understand that they had been sentenced to death by starvation and cold in enemy action unless something miraculous happened to save them. Most of them would not receive that miracle. Most of them would die here in this frozen hell, far from home, for reasons that would seem increasingly meaningless as the weeks passed and the suffering accumulated. But in a dugout in the ruins of a village whose name Weber had never learned, 4 men shared their meager food and made the conscious choice to face what was coming as brothers rather than as individuals. They divided their supplies equally. They tended each other's wounds. They made plans for surviving the next day and the day after that, and however many days followed before circumstances made survival impossible. Kruger extinguished their candle to save it for another night when they would need light more desperately. In the darkness, he spoke one more time. The officers will tell us to hold out, that relief is coming. Maybe it is. But I have been a soldier long enough to know when reassurances are meant to prevent panic rather than to convey truth. We are in serious trouble, the kind of trouble where only luck and brotherhood keep you alive. So here is what we do. We focus on small things. Getting through this hour, this night, tomorrow. We do not think about next week or next month. We survive in increments, and we do it together. Understood? 3 voices answered in the darkness. Understood. Weber lay back against frozen earth and closed his eyes. He thought about his father's bakery in Munich, about the smell of bread baking at 4 in the morning, about a life that seemed to belong to someone else entirely. He thought about Lupescu dying under the treads of a Soviet tank, about the envelope in his pocket, about promises made and promises kept. And he thought about Kruger's words. We survive together, or we die together. In the end, that was all any soldier could ask for. Not victory, not glory, not even survival. Just the knowledge that when death came, it would find men who had refused to abandon each other, who had chosen brotherhood over self-preservation, who had remained human in circumstances designed to strip humanity away. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying snow across the frozen steppe. The temperature dropped. Winter was coming to the pocket, and winter on the Russian steppe showed no mercy to the trapped and the desperate. The first day of the encirclement ended. 103 more days remained before the last German resistance would cease. But the 4 men in that dugout did not know that yet. They knew only that they had survived today and that tomorrow would bring new challenges requiring the same desperate competence that had kept them alive thus far. They slept fitfully, taking turns on watch, conserving body heat by huddling close together. And in Weber's pocket, wrapped in wax paper, a dead man's letter waited for deliverance to a widow who did not yet know she had lost her husband. The trap had closed. The frozen hell had begun. And 4 brothers who had chosen each other over survival itself settled in to face whatever came next with the only weapons that mattered anymore. Trust, loyalty, and the stubborn refusal to abandon hope, even when hope had ceased to make rational sense. The promise came on November 25th, delivered by a colonel whose uniform still looked crisp, despite the chaos surrounding them. The 6th Army would be supplied by air, he announced to the assembled soldiers. The Luftwaffe would deliver 500 tons of supplies daily: food, ammunition, medical supplies, fuel. Everything needed to maintain combat effectiveness. The pocket would be sustained until German forces outside could break through and relieve them. There was no need for panic. The situation was under control. Weber watched the men around him receive this news with expressions that ranged from desperate hope to blank skepticism. They wanted to believe. God, how they wanted to believe. The alternative was too terrible to contemplate, but 8 months on the Eastern Front had taught them the difference between what they were told and what was actually possible. After the colonel departed to deliver the same speech to other units, Kruger pulled the squad aside into the relative privacy of a ruined building. His face carried the expression Weber had learned to recognize, the look of a man doing mathematics in his head and not liking the results. 500 tons per day, Kruger said quietly. Does anyone here know what that means in practical terms? Schmidt, the philosophy student, shook his head. The others remained silent. Kruger picked up a stick and began scratching calculations in the frozen dirt. A Junkers 52 transport carries approximately 2.5 tons of cargo. To deliver 500 tons requires 200 flights per day. The Luftwaffe has perhaps 750 Ju-52s on the entire Eastern Front. Many are committed to other operations. Many are undergoing maintenance. Maybe they can spare 300 for this operation. Maybe. He paused, letting them process the numbers. 300 aircraft making 200 flights means each plane must fly multiple sorties daily, in winter weather, through Soviet air defenses, landing on primitive airfields that are already within artillery range, and maintaining this pace every single day for weeks or months while winter storms ground the fleet for days at a time. The stick broke in Kruger's hand. His voice remained level, but something underneath it had changed, hardened. It is impossible. Mathematically, logistically, practically impossible. The colonel is either lying or he has been lied to. Either way, the result is the same. We will not receive 500 tons per day. We will be lucky to receive 100 tons per day, which means we will slowly starve while waiting for relief that may never come. Becker shifted his weight, favoring his wounded leg. So what do we do? Kruger looked at each of them in turn. We do what we have always done. We share everything equally. We ration carefully. We help each other. And we do not trust official pronouncements. We trust mathematics and logistics and the evidence of our own eyes, understood? The first airlift flight arrived that afternoon. A single Ju-52 appeared through heavy clouds, circled the airfield at Potomnik twice, while ground crews frantically cleared wreckage from the runway, then landed heavily and immediately began taking fire from Soviet artillery that had the field ranged. The crew unloaded supplies in frantic haste while shells burst around them, then took off again with wounded men packed into the fuselage so tightly they could barely breathe. Weber watched this from a distance and counted the crates being unloaded. 20, perhaps 25. Each crate perhaps 50 kilograms. Call it 1.25 tons total for 300,000 men. That night, the squad received their new rations. 200 grams of bread per man, a small piece of cheese, weak soup made from horse bones. Kruger divided everything with surgical precision, making sure each portion was exactly equal. Then they ate slowly, making it last, knowing this might be the most food they would see for days. Schmidt quoted Nietzsche between bites of bread that tasted of sawdust. That which does not kill us makes us stronger. His voice carried a bitter edge that had not been there in the summer. Kruger did not look up from his soup. That which does not kill us today will probably kill us tomorrow. Save the philosophy for when we have full stomachs. The days that followed established a pattern. Airlift flights came sporadically, dependent on weather and Soviet interference. Some days saw 20 or 30 flights. Other days saw none. The tonnage delivered never approached what had been promised, never even came close. And each day, the rations were cut a little more as officers tried to stretch insufficient supplies across an impossible timeline. Weber felt hunger become a constant companion, a gnawing presence that never entirely went away, even immediately after eating. His body began consuming itself, fat reserves depleting first, then muscle tissue breaking down to provide energy. His face grew gaunt. His uniforms hung loose. His thoughts began to circle obsessively around memories of food, of meals eaten in what now seemed like a previous life. He was not alone. Around him, 300,000 men were experiencing the same slow starvation. They talked endlessly about food. They shared recipes and described meals with the loving detail of scholars discussing sacred texts. They dreamed of bread and meat and warm soup and woke to find themselves still trapped in this frozen hell with nothing but thin gruel and promises that rang increasingly hollow. But worse than the hunger was the cold. December brought temperatures that dropped to 30 degrees below zero. The wind that swept across the steppe cut through clothing like knives. Men who had been issued summer uniforms in the expectation that the campaign would end before winter now tried to survive Russian winter with inadequate protection. They wrapped themselves in blankets taken from destroyed buildings. They stuffed newspaper inside their uniforms for insulation. They wore multiple layers of whatever they could find: looking like grotesque parodies of soldiers. But nothing was enough. The cold was too severe, too relentless, too all-encompassing. Frostbite became epidemic. A soldier whose feet got wet faced amputation or death. The wet cold penetrated flesh rapidly. Within hours, tissue would begin freezing. Within days, the tissue would die. Without proper medical treatment, gangrene would set in, and the soldier would die from the systemic infection. Becker's leg wound, which had seemed manageable at first, began showing signs of infection in early December. The shrapnel had been removed by a field medic, the wound cleaned and bandaged. But antibiotics were in short supply, and what existed was reserved for officers and men whose survival seemed more probable. Becker received none. The infection progressed with terrible inevitability. The flesh around the wound turned red, then purple, then began to blacken. The smell changed, acquiring the sweet, rotting odor of necrotic tissue. Becker developed a fever that left him shaking and delirious. And through it all, he apologized constantly for being a burden, for slowing them down, for consuming resources he no longer earned. On December 5th, as they huddled in a basement trying to preserve body heat, Becker pulled Kruger aside and spoke quietly enough that Weber had to strain to hear. The words, when they came, struck like physical blows. "Ernst, my friend, listen to me. I have perhaps 3 days left, maybe 4. The infection is spreading. I can feel it moving up my leg. Soon it will reach my blood, and then I will die anyway. But slowly, painfully. And until then, I will consume rations that could keep you 3 alive longer. I will slow you down. I will reduce your chances of survival." Kruger's face remained expressionless, but his hands clenched into fists. "What are you asking?" "End it for me," Becker said simply. "Quickly, painlessly. Put your pistol to my head while I sleep and pull the trigger. I will never know. I will never suffer. And you 3 will have my rations for the next week. You will have a better chance of surviving. It is the logical choice, the practical choice, the choice that maximizes our collective survival probability." The silence that followed felt like it might crack something fundamental in the structure of reality. Weber found himself unable to breathe, waiting for Kruger's response, knowing that whatever the sergeant decided would define who they were as men and as soldiers. When Kruger finally spoke, his voice carried absolute certainty layered over profound pain. "No, we do not kill our brothers, not even when they ask, not even when they beg. Not even when logic and mathematics and every practical consideration suggests it would be the merciful thing to do." He gripped Becker's shoulder with one powerful hand. "Because once we cross that line, we are no longer soldiers, we are no longer brothers. We are just killers who have learned to rationalize murder by calling it mercy. We are animals fighting over scraps. We are something less than human. You will die when God decides you die. Not when I decide, not when you decide. Until that moment comes, you are part of this squad. You share our food because you are one of us. That does not change because you are wounded. That does not change because you are dying. Brothers do not kill brothers, not now, not ever, not for any reason." Becker's eyes filled with tears that froze on his cheeks before they could fall. "What if the pain becomes unbearable? Then we bear it with you," Kruger said. "We hold your hand. We tell you stories. We remind you that you are not alone. That is what brothers do. We share the burden, all of it, including death." Weber felt something break inside his chest, some last barrier between himself and complete emotional collapse. This was what Kruger had been teaching them all along. That humanity was not something you possessed when circumstances were comfortable. It was something you chose to maintain when circumstances made abandoning it seem rational. That the line between remaining human and becoming something else was not drawn by external forces, but by internal decisions about who you were and what you would not do, regardless of cost. Becker died 3 days later, on January 8th, in his sleep. His body simply stopped functioning, worn down by infection and starvation, and the accumulated weight of suffering that exceeded what human flesh could endure. He passed quietly in the darkness, surrounded by his brothers, having been granted the dignity of dying as a human being rather than being killed like an animal. They buried him in frozen ground that required 3 hours of labor to excavate to adequate depth. They marked the grave with a simple cross made from wood scavenged from destroyed buildings. They stood over it in the bitter cold and said words that felt inadequate, but which had to be said because silence would have been worse. Kruger spoke for all of them. Hans Becker was a good soldier and a better man. He loved his wife and children. He did his duty. He faced death with courage. He remained human when everything around him was designed to strip humanity away. We were honored to call him brother. We will remember him until we join him. After the burial, as they walked back to their positions through ruins that looked like something from the end of the world, Schmidt spoke quietly. You made the right choice, not killing him. It would have been easier to do it, more practical. But wrong. You kept us human. Kruger did not respond immediately. When he did, his voice carried exhaustion beyond anything physical. I made the only choice I could live with. Whether it was right or wrong, I do not know. I know only that I could not kill my brother and remain the man I want to be when this is over. If this is ever over, Weber thought but did not say aloud. On December 12th, salvation seemed to arrive. Word spread through the pocket that Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, arguably Germany's most talented operational commander, had assembled a relief force southwest of the encirclement. The 4th Panzer Army, including some of Germany's best remaining units, was attacking northeast toward the pocket. If anyone could break through Soviet defenses and relieve the trapped 6th Army, it was Manstein. The squad received this news with the first genuine hope they had felt since the encirclement began. Kruger, normally skeptical of official pronouncements, allowed himself cautious optimism. Manstein is competent, he said. If the relief force has adequate strength, and if the weather cooperates, and if Soviet reinforcements do not arrive too quickly, he might actually succeed. Over the next week, they tracked the progress of Manstein's offensive through rumors and official reports and the distant sound of artillery fire that grew incrementally closer each day. On December 13th, the relief force was 45 kilometers away. On December 15th, 40 kilometers. On December 18th, 35 kilometers. Close enough that on quiet nights, when the wind blew from the southwest, they could see the flashes of gunfire on the horizon. The entire pocket held its breath. Rescue was within reach. Salvation measured in kilometers rather than dreams. Men who had resigned themselves to death began planning what they would eat when supplies arrived. They wrote letters to families they might actually see again. They allowed themselves to hope. On December 19th, where Kruger assembled a squad in the ruins of a factory where they had been assigned to defensive positions. His face carried an expression Weber had not seen before. Not despair exactly. Something harder and more complex. Manstein is 35 kilometers away, Kruger said without preamble. He is stalled by Soviet resistance and winter weather. But more importantly, he has sent urgent messages to Paulus ordering the 6th Army to break out toward the relief force, to attack westward while Manstein attacks eastward, to link up and escape the pocket before Soviet reinforcements can prevent it. Schmidt leaned forward. So we break out? We abandon Stalingrad and meet Manstein? Kruger shook his head slowly. Paulus has refused. His orders from Hitler are to hold Stalingrad. Breaking out would require abandoning heavy equipment, leaving behind the wounded who cannot walk, giving up the city that Hitler has insisted must be held at any cost. Paulus will not disobey direct orders from the Führer. Not even when disobedience is the only rational choice. The implications settled over them like a physical weight. The relief force was within reach. Survival was possible, but it would require initiative that their commanding general would not take. It would require disobeying orders that were clearly wrong. It would require choosing survival over loyalty. Weber spoke up. What about us? Can we break out on our own? Kruger looked at him for a long moment before responding. That is the question, is it not? High command will not order a breakout. Paulus will not order a breakout. But we are soldiers, not slaves. We have the ability to decide for ourselves. So I'm going to ask each of you directly. Do we try to break out toward Manstein? Or do we stay with the 6th Army and trust that someone will eventually make the decision our survival requires? The silence stretched. Weber felt the weight of the choice pressing down on him. Breaking out meant abandoning the army, Technically desertion, even if strategically sound. It meant traveling 35 kilometers through Soviet lines with a wounded man who could barely walk. It meant risking summary execution if they were caught by German military police. But it also meant a chance at survival. Staying meant trusting that orders would change, that Paulus would eventually authorize a breakout, that the chain of command would choose rationality over loyalty to Hitler's directives. It meant remaining soldiers rather than becoming fugitives. But it also meant accepting that their survival depended on decisions being made by men who had already demonstrated poor judgment. Kruger looked at Schmidt first. Otto? The philosophy student seemed to be choosing his words with care. Orders are the foundation of military discipline. Without them, we are just a mob with guns. If every soldier decided for himself which orders to follow, armies would cease to function. So as much as it pains me, as much as every rational calculation suggests we should run, I say we stay. We trust the chain of command. We remain soldiers. Kruger nodded and turned to Weber. Klaus? Weber thought about Lupescu's letter in his pocket, about the promise he had made to a dead man, about whether that promise could ever be kept if he died here in this frozen pocket because he followed orders that made no sense. He thought about his father's bakery in Munich, about a life that seemed increasingly unlikely to resume. He thought about what Kruger had taught them about brotherhood and humanity, and the lines that separated soldiers from deserters. I say we stay, Weber said finally, not because I think it is the smart choice, but because if we run, we are no longer part of something larger than ourselves. We are just individuals trying to survive, and I would rather die as a soldier who trusted his brothers than live as a deserter who abandoned them. Kruger absorbed their answers in silence. Then he spoke, and his voice carried the weight of a man who had made his decision before asking, but had needed them to make theirs independently. I vote we stay as well, not because I believe Paulus will make the right decision. I do not. Not because I think we will be rescued, I doubt it, but because I need to know that when this is over, when we face whatever judgment comes after death, I remained a soldier who followed his conscience. And my conscience says you do not abandon your army because the situation is difficult. You do not desert because the odds are bad. You stand with your brothers and you face what comes. He looked at each of them in turn. We are agreed then. We stay. We trust each other. We survive together or we die together. But we do it as soldiers, not as fugitives. They shook hands on it, a solemn ritual that felt like signing their own death warrants. And in a sense, perhaps they were. But they had made the choice themselves, consciously and deliberately. Whatever happened next, they would own it. They would not be victims of circumstance, but men who had chosen their path and accepted its consequences. That night, December 19th, Soviet reinforcements arrived on Manstein's northern flank and launched a counteroffensive against the Italian Eighth Army. The Italians, even more poorly equipped than the Romanians had been, collapsed under the assault. Suddenly, Manstein faced the possibility of being encircled himself. His relief force, instead of driving forward to link with the Sixth Army, had to retreat to avoid being trapped. Captain Dmitry Volkov's tank battalion had been positioned to block Manstein's advance. For 10 days, his unit had fought desperate defensive actions against German armor that possessed superior tactical skill, even if not superior numbers. Volkov had lost 30% of his battalion during Manstein's offensive, including his best friend since before the war, Sergeant Ivan Petrov, killed when a German 88mm gun penetrated his tank's frontal armor and detonated the ammunition. Volkov had pulled Petrov's body from the burning wreck himself, had held his friend while he died, had promised to write to his widow and explain that Ivan's death had meant something. Now with Manstein's forces retreating, Volkov sat in his tank and wrote that letter by the light of a single candle. The words came hard. How do you explain to a woman that her husband died to keep other men trapped so they could starve? How do you frame that as noble sacrifice rather than as simple brutality? In the end, Volkov wrote what he believed. Ivan died defending our motherland against invaders. He died so our children would not grow up under fascist occupation. He died doing his duty as a soldier. These things were true. If incomplete, they would have to suffice. He folded the letter and addressed it and handed it to his political officer for censorship and mailing. Then he opened the letter from his wife that had arrived that morning. His daughter Katya had drawn a picture of a tank with Papa written on the side in a child's uncertain hand. His wife wrote that Katya prayed for him every night, that she asked when Papa would come home, that she did not understand why the war was taking so long. Volkov studied his daughter's drawing and felt something break inside his chest. He was fighting so she would never know war. So she would grow up in a world where foreign soldiers did not murder civilians and burn villages and reduce cities to rubble. That was worth Ivan's death. That was worth his own death if it came to that. That had to be worth it because the alternative was unbearable. By December 23rd, Operation Winterstorm had failed. The relief force withdrew to its starting positions, having suffered heavy casualties and achieved nothing. The 6th Army remained trapped. The last realistic chance for escape had passed. Now there was only waiting for death or capture, and the distinction between those options seemed increasingly meaningless. The squad received this news in silence. They had made their choice to stay. Now they would live or die with that choice. There was no point in second-guessing or regret. They had decided as free men. That was all any soldier could ask. Christmas approached with the inexorability of a death sentence. The squad had saved rations carefully over the preceding week, denying themselves in the present to have something approaching adequate food for Christmas Day. It was not much. 400 grams of bread divided 3 ways now that Becker was gone. A small piece of horse meat that might have been tender once, but was now frozen harder than wood. Weak tea made from melted snow and leaves they had found in an abandoned house. But on Christmas Eve, as they sat in a basement lit by a single candle, they divided this feast and ate slowly, and tried to remember what it felt like to be human beings rather than starving animals. Kruger spoke first, his voice carrying uncharacteristic softness. I have a wife named Greta, and a son named Peter, who is 16, and a daughter named Sophie, who is 12. Peter wants to be an engineer. Sophie wants to be a teacher. I have not seen them since last Christmas. I do not know if I will ever see them again, but I think about them every day, about walking through our door and sitting at our table and eating Greta's Christmas goose with all of us together. Schmidt went next, reciting Schiller from memory, the words flowing with the practiced ease of someone who had spent years studying poetry. Joy, beautiful spark of divinity, daughter from Elysium, we enter, drunk with fire, heavenly one, thy sanctuary. He paused. I used to think I understood what that meant, about joy and divinity and brotherhood. I do not think I understood anything before this war. But now I understand that the only divinity that matters is what we create between us. The only sanctuary is what we build with our loyalty and trust. Weber's turn came last. He spoke about his father's bakery, about being 14 and learning to knead dough at 4 in the morning, about the smell of bread baking and the satisfaction of creating something people needed. He talked about planning to inherit the bakery someday, to carry on his father's work, to spend his life feeding his neighbors. Simple ambitions that seemed impossibly distant now. Then he pulled out 2 envelopes. One was Lupescu's letter to his wife. The other was a letter Weber had written himself, addressed to Elena Lupescu. I made a promise to deliver this, Weber said, holding up Lupescu's letter, but I cannot keep that promise. I will probably die here. This letter will never reach the woman it was meant for. So I wrote another one. He opened his own letter and read aloud. Dear Frau Lupescu, I am writing to tell you about your husband's last days. Anton was a good man and a brave officer. He treated his soldiers well. He shared what little he had. He spoke of you and your son Mihai constantly. He showed me photographs and told me stories about teaching in Bucharest. He died doing his duty, thinking of his family. I wanted you to know that he faced death with courage and that his last words were of his love for you. Weber folded the letter carefully. I know this letter will never be delivered either, but I needed to write it. I needed to try to honor my promise, even knowing I would fail. Because keeping promises is what separates us from animals, even when we cannot actually keep them. The silence that followed felt sacred somehow, as though they had participated in some ritual that connected them to something larger than their individual suffering. They had shared their memories and their hopes and their understanding that those things might be all that remained of them when this was over. At 10:30 on Christmas Eve, They heard the sound of an aircraft engine approaching from the west. A supply flight, attempting to reach the pocket despite heavy clouds and Soviet fighters. They went outside and watched as the Ju-52 appeared briefly through a gap in the overcast, low and slow and desperately vulnerable. The Soviet anti-aircraft fire began immediately. Tracer rounds arced upward in streams of light. The transport tried to climb, tried to evade, but it was too low and too slow. They watched as rounds struck the fuselage, as smoke began streaming from the left engine, as the pilot fought for control. The plane did not explode. It simply fell, gracefully almost, like a leaf spiraling down in autumn. It struck the ground 3 kilometers from their position with a sound like distant thunder. Then silence. Then the orange glow of fire spreading across the snow. Kruger stared at the burning wreck for a long moment. That was Oberst Franz Müller. I knew him before the war. Good man, competent pilot. He knew this airlift was impossible. He told his superiors. They ignored him. So he kept flying anyway because that was his duty. Now he is dead, trying to deliver supplies we will never receive to men who will probably die regardless. They stood watching the flames until the cold drove them back inside. Christmas morning came with clear skies and temperatures that dropped to 40 below zero. Soviet forces launched attacks across multiple sectors of the pocket perimeter. The airlift brought no supplies because the weather had grounded the transport fleet. The squad spent Christmas Day fighting off Soviet probes, burning their last reserves of energy to maintain positions that no longer served any strategic purpose. They did not speak about the holiday. They did not mention the dinner they had shared the night before. They simply fought and rested and fought again, conserving ammunition, making every shot count because resupply was no longer certain. On January 10th, the airfield at Gumerak, the last functioning airstrip inside the pocket, came under sustained Soviet artillery fire. For 5 days, ground crews tried to maintain operations while shells destroyed aircraft on the ground and cratered runways. On January 15th, a shell struck the command bunker, killing everyone inside. On January 16th, the Soviets launched a ground assault. By January 25th, Gumerak had fallen. There was no longer any way to fly supplies into the pocket or to evacuate wounded. The encircled army was completely isolated. The 300,000 men trapped in Stalingrad would receive no more food, no more ammunition, no more medical supplies. They would fight with what they had until it ran out. Then they would die. Weber watched the last transport aircraft take off from Gumerak on the afternoon of January 24th. The plane was so overloaded with wounded that it barely cleared the trees at the end of the runway. He watched it climb slowly toward the west, toward Germany, toward a world where men ate regular meals and slept in warm beds and did not measure their survival in grams of moldy bread. That night, sitting in their basement with the temperature so cold their breath froze on their blankets, Kruger spoke what they had all been thinking. This is how we die. Not in battle, not heroically, but slowly, from starvation and cold, waiting for spring that we will never see. Schmidt, propped against the wall with his shoulder wound bandaged with strips torn from their last spare shirt, managed a weak smile. At least we die together. At least we kept our promise to each other. He quoted one last piece of philosophy, his voice barely above a whisper. He who has a why to live can bear almost any how. Nietzsche wrote that. I think I finally understand it. We survive because we survive together. The how does not matter anymore. Only the why. Weber pulled Lupescu's letter from his pocket and held it in hands that shook from cold and weakness. The promise he could not keep. The obligation that would die with him. He thought about Elena Lupescu receiving notification that her husband had been killed in action. No details. No explanation. No letter from a friend explaining that Anton had died thinking of her. I failed him, Weber said quietly. I promised to deliver this. I cannot. I failed. Kruger reached over and gripped Weber's shoulder with what little strength remained in his hand. You kept the promise that mattered. You tried. You carried his letter through hell itself. You wrote to his widow even knowing the letter would never arrive. That is keeping faith. That is honoring the dead. The fact that circumstance prevented delivery does not diminish the promise. Outside, the wind howled across the frozen steppe. The temperature continued dropping. Soviet forces tightened the noose around the pocket, preparing for final assaults that would reduce the encirclement through systematic destruction of isolated strongpoints. The body began failing in ways that medical textbooks described with clinical precision, but which bore no resemblance to the actual experience of slow starvation. January brought rations reduced to 100 grams of bread per day, approximately 4 ounces, supplemented by soup that was mostly water, with perhaps a few shreds of horse meat or potato floating in it. The bread was often moldy, mixed with sawdust to stretch the flour supply. The soup was thin enough to see through. Weber felt his body consuming itself from the inside out. The fat reserves had depleted weeks ago. Now muscle tissue was being broken down to provide energy, leaving him weak in ways that went beyond simple tiredness. Tasks that had been routine became exhausting. Walking required conscious effort. Standing upright demanded concentration. His thoughts moved through thick fog, everything requiring more mental energy than it should. Around him, 300,000 men experienced the same deterioration. Their faces grew gaunt, skin stretching tight over skull bones. Their eyes sank deep into sockets, shadowed with exhaustion and malnutrition. Their movements became slow and deliberate, the economical motion of organisms trying to conserve every calorie. They stopped talking about food because talking required energy they could not spare. They stopped planning for futures that seemed increasingly unlikely. They simply existed, hour by hour, conserving what little life remained. Medical science documented the progression with dispassionate accuracy. After fat and muscle came the vital organs themselves. The heart muscle weakened, unable to pump blood efficiently. Cognitive function declined as the brain received insufficient glucose. The immune system collapsed, leaving the starving vulnerable to infections that healthy bodies would fight off easily. In the final stages, edema caused swelling in limbs and face as fluid accumulated in tissues. The skin became thin and bruised easily. Hair fell out. Teeth loosened. The person became apathetic, too exhausted to care about their own survival. Death came from multiple organ failure or from some opportunistic infection that the ruined immune system could not resist. It was not dramatic. It was not heroic. It was simply the body shutting down when it had consumed everything consumable and had nothing left to burn. On January 30th, the 10th anniversary of Hitler's rise to power, the Führer promoted General Friedrich Paulus to Field Marshal, making him the youngest Field Marshal in German history. The news spread through the pocket with the speed of wildfire. At first, some men took it as a sign that their sacrifice was recognized, that they remained important to the Reich's strategic calculations. But others understood immediately what the promotion actually meant. No German field marshal had ever surrendered. The promotion was not an honor, it was a message. It was Hitler's way of telling Paulus that he was expected to either fight to the death or commit suicide rather than fall into Soviet hands. It was a death sentence disguised in ceremonial form. Paulus understood. He sent a final radio transmission to Hitler's headquarters acknowledging the promotion and stating that the Sixth Army would fight to its last breath. Then he sat in his basement headquarters in the Univermag department store and waited for the end with the exhausted resignation of a man who had followed orders all his life and could not imagine doing otherwise even when those orders had destroyed his army. The end came the next day, January 31st. Soviet forces stormed the Univermag building in a final assault designed to capture the German command structure. Lieutenant Ivan Petrov Jr., nephew of the sergeant killed during Manstein's offensive, led the team that descended into the basement where Paulus and his staff were sheltering. Later, Petrov would describe the scene with details that stripped away any romance or drama. We expected to fight for every room. We had grenades ready. We were prepared for final desperate resistance. Nazi officers were supposed to be fanatics who would rather die than surrender. But when we broke through the door to the command room, we found German officers sitting at a table as if conducting a staff meeting. They did not resist. They looked like corpses that had not yet realized they were dead. Paulus was at the head of the table in his uniform with his new field marshal insignia. He looked exhausted beyond anything I had ever seen. Ill. Defeated in ways that went beyond military situation. When I announced that he was now a prisoner of the Soviet Union, he simply nodded and stood up slowly, as if standing required all his remaining strength. There was no drama, no final defiant speech, no suicide, just tired men surrendering because there was literally nothing else they could do. But Paulus's surrender did not end the fighting. Hitler's orders forbidding surrender still stood for the rest of the army. Many German units continued fighting because they chose to obey those orders, because they feared Soviet treatment of prisoners, or because they simply had no way to surrender, cut off from communications and surrounded by Soviet forces more interested in destroying them than capturing them. The northern pocket, where Weber's squad was positioned, continued fighting. Colonel General Karl Strecker, commanding what remained of German forces in that sector, refused to surrender without authorization from higher command. His men, perhaps 50,000 of them, held positions in the ruins of the tractor factory district, where some of the war's most vicious urban combat had taken place throughout the autumn. Weber and Schmidt and Kruger found themselves in this final pocket, defending positions that served no strategic purpose, fighting for reasons that had ceased to make sense weeks ago. They had 18 rounds of ammunition between them. They had not eaten in 2 days. They could barely stand without support, but they were still soldiers, still following orders, still maintaining the fiction that what they did mattered. Captain Dmitry Volkov's tank battalion entered the city from the west on February 1st as part of the final reduction operations. His orders were to eliminate remaining German strongpoints and secure the factory district. He had been fighting for more than 2 months, had lost 60% of his unit, had watched friends die, and had killed more men than he could count. He wanted this to be over. He wanted to go home to his daughter. He wanted to sleep without dreaming of burning tanks and screaming men. His unit advanced through ruins that exceeded anything he had imagined possible. Stalingrad had been a city of 400,000 people before the war. Now it was a landscape of absolute destruction. Not a single building stood intact. Most structures had been reduced to rubble. The famous factories were heaps of twisted metal and broken concrete. The residential districts had been burned and bombed and shelled until nothing recognizable remained. And scattered through these ruins lay evidence of the human cost. Thousands of frozen corpses, German and Soviet both, in various positions of death. Some looked almost peaceful, curled as if sleeping. Others showed the violence of their deaths, torn by shrapnel or bullets, missing limbs, faces destroyed. The extreme cold had preserved them perfectly, creating a grotesque museum of mortality. Volkov's tank passed a German foxhole and he saw a photograph lying in the snow. He ordered his driver to stop and climbed down to retrieve it. The photograph showed a young German soldier standing with a woman and 2 small children, a family portrait taken in happier times. On the back, someone had written Anna and the Children, Christmas 1941. Volkov pocketed the photograph. Someone should remember they were human, he thought. Someone should know they had families and lives and reasons to want to survive beyond following orders. On February 1st, the squad received orders to defend a position in the factory ruins. 3 men now, Kruger, Schmidt, Weber, all that remained of the 4 who had started this journey together. They had 10 rounds of ammunition each, no food, no water except what they could melt from snow, no realistic hope of survival. They moved to their assigned position as the sun rose over the devastated city. The factory had been a structure of iron and concrete that once built tractors. Now it was an abstract sculpture of destruction. Beams twisted into impossible angles. Walls collapsed. Machinery scattered and broken. Schmidt spoke as they took up positions among the rubble. "Do you think anyone will remember us? After this is over? Will anyone know we were here?" Kruger checked his rifle, moving with the automatic precision of someone who had performed this action 10,000 times. "Someone will remember. Maybe not our names. Maybe not our specific actions. But someone will study this battle and try to understand what happened here. And if they look closely enough, they will see that soldiers on both sides fought bravely and suffered terribly and remained human despite everything. That is worth remembering." Weber touched the 2 envelopes in his pocket. Lupescu's letter and his own letter to Elena Lupescu. Both would die with him. Both promises would remain unfulfilled. The weight of that failure pressed against his chest like a physical presence. The Soviet attack began mid-morning. Not an assault, really. More like pest control. Artillery prepared the position for 30 minutes, systematically destroying anything that might provide cover. Then infantry advanced methodically, in no particular hurry, knowing that defenders were too weak and too poorly supplied to mount effective resistance. The squad fired their meager ammunition carefully, making every shot count. They dropped several Soviet soldiers before return fire forced them to take cover. They tried to maneuver, to find positions that would allow them to continue fighting, but their bodies would not obey anymore. They were too weak, too slow, too depleted. Schmidt was hit first, a round through the shoulder that spun him around and dropped him. He cried out in pain but remained conscious, blood spreading across his uniform. Weber grabbed him and pulled him behind cover, while Kruger provided covering fire. The three of them retreated deeper into the ruins, Schmidt supported between Weber and Kruger, trying to find some way to continue resisting, even though resistance had become meaningless. They reached a position where concrete walls provided protection on three sides. Then Kruger was hit, a burst of machine gun fire that struck him in the chest and abdomen. He collapsed against the wall and slid down slowly, leaving a trail of blood on concrete. Weber dropped beside him and tried to stop the bleeding, but there was too much damage, too many wounds. Kruger gripped Weber's arm with one hand. His voice came in whispers, punctuated by coughing. "Klaus, Otto, listen to me. You two survived together. That means something. You remember us. You tell people we were here. You tell them we chose honor over survival, that we remain brothers, that we stayed human. Promise me." "We promise," Weber said, tears freezing on his face. Schmidt, pale with blood loss and pain, nodded his agreement. Kruger's grip weakened. "Good. That is victory. Not surviving, but remaining who we were. You and Otto and Hans and me. We were brothers. That is what matters. That is what survives." His hand fell away. His eyes remained open, but the life behind them had departed. Feldwebel Ernst Kruger, 34 years old, former miner from the Ruhr, the best man Weber had ever known, was dead. Weber and Schmidt remained kneeling beside the body for perhaps 2 minutes before Soviet soldiers appeared around the corner. They raised their hands slowly. They had no more ammunition. They had no more strength to fight. They had no more reason to resist. They surrendered together. The Soviet soldiers were professionals, not interested in revenge or cruelty. They searched them efficiently, removed their weapons, checked for wounds. One of them offered water from a canteen. Weber drank and felt the cold liquid hit his stomach like a shock. Schmidt drank as well, his shoulder bleeding but the wound not immediately life-threatening. Captain Dmitry Volkov appeared, surveying the captured position and the dead German soldiers scattered among the ruins. He looked at Weber and Schmidt and saw what everyone saw, walking skeletons in torn uniforms, barely alive, held upright only by will and habit. Volkov began searching Weber's pockets, standard procedure for prisoners. He found identification papers, a photograph of a family, and 2 envelopes, both showing signs of having been carried for a long time, both carefully preserved despite exposure to weather and combat. Volkov opened the first envelope and read the letter inside. It was in Romanian, addressed to Elena Lupescu from her husband Anton, a final message from a man who knew he was going to die and wanted his family to know he loved them. The kind of letter soldiers had been writing since warfare began. The second envelope contained a letter in German. Volkov's German was adequate for military purposes. He read Weber's account of Lupescu's death, the description of a brave officer thinking of his family in his final moments, the attempt to honor a promise made to a dying man. Volkov looked at Weber with new assessment. "You wrote this? About a Romanian officer?" Weber nodded, too exhausted for words. "You carried these through the entire encirclement? Tried to keep your promise even knowing you could not deliver them?" Another nod. Volkov stood silent for a long moment, thinking about his own letters to his daughter, about promises made and kept, about what defined a soldier versus what defined a good man. Finally he spoke, his voice carrying weight that suggested this was not a casual decision. "I will try to deliver these. No promises, but I will try. Soldiers should keep promises when possible, even to dead men, even across enemy lines." Weber found his voice, cracked and weak but still capable of speech. "Why would you do that?" Volkov looked at the ruins around them, at the frozen corpses and destroyed city and evidence of suffering that exceeded any reasonable bounds. Because this war has made us all into killers. But maybe we do not have to let it make us into monsters. Maybe keeping one promise, delivering one letter means we remain human. Maybe that matters more than victory or defeat. He pocketed both letters and turned to his men. Take them to the collection point with the other prisoners. Give them food and water. They are not enemies anymore. They are just men who need help. The march to the prisoner collection point took 3 hours. Weber and Schmidt walked in a column with hundreds of other captured German soldiers, guarded by Soviet infantry who showed neither cruelty nor compassion, just professional detachment. They passed through what remained of Stalingrad, through ruins that would haunt their dreams for the rest of their lives. At the collection point, Soviet medics provided rudimentary care: water, a small piece of bread, bandages for minor wounds. Schmidt's shoulder was cleaned and wrapped properly. The bleeding stopped. Then the prisoners were formed into larger groups for transport to camps in the Soviet interior. The march east began on February 3rd. Thousands of prisoners, many barely able to walk, forced to cover 20 to 30 kilometers per day through winter weather that showed no mercy. Men collapsed during these marches and were left behind because the guards had neither resources nor authorization to help them. Those who fell knew they would die where they lay. Most accepted this with the numb resignation of men who had exhausted their capacity for hope. Weber and Schmidt stayed together, supporting each other when weakness threatened to drop them. They had lost Kruger and Becker, but they still had each other. They shared what little food the Soviets provided at regular intervals. They took turns helping the other when stumbling threatened to become falling. They became each other's reason to survive one more day, then one more after that. They were the last two members of a squad that had once been four. They would honor their brothers by surviving if survival was possible. The transit camp at Krasnogorsk was barely functional. Overcrowded barracks without adequate heat, minimal food, non-existent sanitation. Disease spread through the weakened population like wildfire. Typhus, dysentery, pneumonia, tuberculosis. Men who had survived the battle died in the camps from causes that would have been preventable with proper medical care. Otto Schmidt died on February 15th, 12 days after capture. The typhus had consumed him rapidly, fever and delirium followed by organ failure and death. Weber sat beside him through the final night, holding his hand, listening to him quote Nietzsche and Schiller in moments of lucidity, trying to offer comfort through presence, if not through medicine or food. In his final moments of clarity, Otto gripped Weber's hand and whispered, "Kruger was right. We stayed human. That is what matters. Remember us, Klaus. Remember we chose honor." Then he quoted Schiller one last time, his voice barely audible. "Joy, beautiful spark of divinity. We enter, drunk with fire, thy sanctuary." His grip loosened. His breathing stopped. He was gone. When Otto died, Weber found himself completely alone for the first time since April 1942. Kruger was gone. Becker was gone. Schmidt was gone. The squad that had been his world, his family, his reason for surviving, had been reduced to memory. He was the last one, the only one left to remember them. He sat beside Otto's body until Soviet guards came to remove it for burial in the mass graves. He tried to say something, some final words, but nothing seemed adequate. In the end, he simply whispered, "I will remember, I promise. I will remember all of you." He should have died in that camp. By all probability and logic, he should have joined his brothers in the mass graves where prisoners were buried without ceremony or identification. But somehow he survived the typhus. Somehow his body fought off the infection that killed thousands around him. Somehow he made it through winter and into spring and was eventually transferred to a labor camp in Siberia where conditions were harsh, but where the death rate was lower than it had been in the transit camps. The years that followed blurred together in memory. Labor camps scattered across the Soviet Union, mining coal, building infrastructure, working 12-hour days on minimal rations, slowly regaining strength as Soviet logistics improved and prisoner rations increased. Learning Russian, making cautious friendships with guards and fellow prisoners. Surviving not because he wanted to, but because his brothers would have wanted him to survive. In 1953, Klaus Weber was among approximately 6,000 German prisoners repatriated from Soviet captivity. Of the 91,000 who had surrendered at Stalingrad, these 6,000 were all that remained. The rest had died in the camps or during the marches or simply vanished into the vast Soviet system without record or trace. Weber stepped off the train in Munich on a cold morning in October. He was 30 years old but looked 50. His hair had gone gray. His face carried lines carved by suffering and deprivation. He weighed 60 kilograms, 20 less than when he had entered the army. But he was alive. Impossibly, improbably, he was alive. The bakery still existed. His father had died in 1945, the official cause listed as heart failure, but everyone knew it was grief over losing his son. His mother had remarried to a kind man who ran a small shop. She fainted when she saw Klaus at the door, literally collapsed, because she had buried him in her mind 10 years earlier. The reunion was difficult in ways neither of them had anticipated. She wanted her son back. He could not give her that because her son had died in Russia, and what had returned was someone else wearing the same name. They tried. They made efforts. But the gap between what she remembered and what he had become was too wide to bridge. In early 1954, Weber received a package from Moscow. It had been forwarded through multiple agencies, passed from Soviet Veterans Committee to International Red Cross to German authorities to finally reach him. Inside were 2 letters, both showing signs of having been carried for years, both carefully preserved despite age and handling. The first was Lupescu's letter to his wife. The second was Weber's letter to Elena Lupescu. And attached to them was a note written in Russian with German translation attached. Herr Weber, the note began, I am Colonel Dmitry Volkov, formerly Captain Commanding Tank Battalion at Stalingrad. I promised to try to deliver these letters. It took 9 years, but I have kept my promise. The note explained that Volkov had spent years after the war tracking down Elena Lupescu's address in Romania. The communist bureaucracy had made it difficult but not impossible. In 1953, he had finally located her and personally delivered both letters. She had wept reading her husband's final words. She had thanked Volkov for his service in delivering them, and she had asked him to convey her gratitude to the German soldier who had honored her husband's memory. The note concluded, She asked me to thank you for honoring her husband's memory and to tell you that your words helped her son Mihai understand his father died with honor. Soldiers keep promises, even across enemy lines, even across years. This is what makes us human rather than just killers. I hope you have found peace. D. Volkov. Weber sat in his small apartment holding these letters and wept for the first time since the war ended. Not from sadness exactly, from release, from the lifting of a burden he had carried for more than a decade. He had kept his promise, or rather Volkov had kept it for him. The debt had been paid, the obligation fulfilled. Lupescu's widow knew her husband's last thoughts. His son knew his father died with honor. Weber wrote back to Volkov immediately. A simple letter expressing gratitude and acknowledging the extraordinary grace of the Soviet officer's actions. He did not know if the letter ever reached its destination. The Cold War had made communication between former enemies difficult and suspect. But he wrote it anyway because some things need to be said regardless of whether they are received. In 1955, Klaus Weber used his small inheritance and his repatriation compensation to open a bakery in Munich. He named it Kruger and Sons over the objections of city officials who pointed out that was not his name. He insisted. This bakery honored the memory of men who had taught him what it meant to remain human in circumstances designed to destroy humanity. The first customer, a young woman perhaps 20 years old, asked about the name. Why Kruger and Sons when your name is Weber? Weber handed her the fresh bread he had baked that morning at 4 a.m., continuing the tradition his father had started decades earlier. Kruger was my sergeant, the finest man I ever knew. He taught me that brotherhood is not following orders blindly. It is making impossible choices and remaining human anyway. It is choosing honor over survival when survival means abandoning who you are. This bakery honors his memory and the memory of 2 other men who were my brothers in ways that matter more than blood. The woman accepted this explanation and left with her bread. Over the years, others would ask the same question and receive the same answer. Some understood, some did not. Weber did not care. The name remained. He never spoke publicly about Stalingrad except once, in 1989, when a local school asked him to address students about the war. He was 66 years old, still rising at 4 a.m. to bake bread, still carrying the weight of memories that would never entirely release their grip. He stood before these teenagers who had never known war and would hopefully never have to learn its lessons directly, and he told them what he thought they needed to hear. We were told we fought for Germany. Maybe we did. I do not know anymore. What I know is that in that frozen hell, we fought for each other. My sergeant taught me that brotherhood is not blind obedience. It is making impossible choices and living with them. It is refusing to cross certain lines even when crossing them seems rational. It is remaining human when everything around you is designed to strip humanity away. He paused, gathering his thoughts. War is waste. War is failure. War is young men dying for reasons that make less sense the more time passes. But what men do for each other in war, that stubborn loyalty and sacrifice and determination to remain human, that is the only thing worth remembering. Not the battles, not the strategy, not the politics, but the fact that even in the worst circumstances humans have ever created, some men chose honor over survival. Some men kept their promises even knowing they would die. Some men remained brothers when becoming animals would have been easier. The students listened in silence. Weber looked at their faces and hoped they would never need to apply these lessons. Hoped they would live in a world where such choices were not required. But he knew hope was not enough. Vigilance was required. Memory was required. Understanding that the price of abandoning humanity was always higher than the cost of maintaining it. Klaus Weber died in 2005 at age 82. He died in his sleep, peacefully, surrounded by family he had built after returning from Russia. His daughter found him in the morning, still and quiet, released finally from memories that had haunted him for more than 60 years. The bakery passed to his grandson, who maintained the name and the tradition. Above the door, a plaque was installed, in memory of Feldwebel Ernst Kruger, Gefreiter Otto Schmidt, Schütze Hans Becker, brothers who chose honor over survival. The final casualty statistics for Stalingrad remain disputed, but the commonly accepted figures are staggering beyond comprehension. Soviet military casualties exceeded 1,100,000, including nearly 500,000 dead or missing. German and Axis casualties approached 800,000, including nearly 400,000 dead. Civilian casualties in Stalingrad itself likely exceeded 40,000. Total casualties for the battle exceeded 2 million, making Stalingrad the bloodiest battle in human history. The physical destruction of the city was total. Not a single building remained intact. The famous factories were heaps of twisted metal. The residential districts were burned and bombed until nothing recognizable remained. The city that had been home to 400,000 people was an uninhabitable wasteland. Stalingrad marked the turning point of the war on the Eastern Front and arguably of World War II itself. Before Stalingrad, the Wehrmacht could claim to be undefeated in major operations on land. After Stalingrad, that myth was shattered. An entire German army, one of the Wehrmacht's finest formations, had been destroyed. The psychological impact on both sides was enormous. The city was eventually rebuilt and renamed Volgograd in 1961. The Mamayev Kurgan Memorial Complex, with its massive statue the motherland calls standing 85 meters tall, became one of the Soviet Union's most important monuments. Millions visit annually, Russians and foreigners both, trying to understand what happened in this place and why it mattered. In the 21st century, as the last survivors of Stalingrad reach extreme old age and pass away, the battle transitions from living memory to history. Soon there will be no one left who fought at Stalingrad, no one who can describe from personal experience what it was like. The voices fall silent, the memories fade, only the records remain. But perhaps some things transcend personal memory. Perhaps the lessons of Stalingrad persist regardless of whether anyone remains who learned them firsthand. The capacity of human beings to endure almost unimaginable suffering, the terrible consequences of leaders who place political objectives above human lives, the courage ordinary people display when circumstances demand it. the importance of remaining human even when circumstances make abandoning humanity seem rational. The frozen hell has passed into history. The ruins have been rebuilt. The dead have been buried. But Stalingrad remains not just as a place on a map or a chapter in history books, but as a testament to the extremes of human experience, to the depths of suffering and the heights of courage that war brings forth. The soldiers who fought at Stalingrad, German and Soviet, would probably not want to be remembered as heroes or villains. They were simply men who did what they had to do in circumstances they did not choose. They fought because that was what soldiers do. They endured because there was no alternative. They hoped because hope is fundamental to human nature even when circumstances make hope irrational. And some of them, a few, made choices that transcended mere survival. They chose to remain human when becoming animals would have been easier. They kept promises even knowing those promises might cost them their lives. They maintained honor when honor served no practical purpose. They were brothers to each other when brotherhood was all that remained. That is what Klaus Weber and Ernst Kruger and Otto Schmidt and Hans Becker gave to history. Not victories or defeats, not tactics or strategies, but the example of men who faced impossible choices and chose honor over survival, who remained human in circumstances designed to strip humanity away, who proved that even in the worst hell humans can create, some will refuse to abandon what makes us more than just sophisticated animals. Of the four brothers who entered the encirclement together in November 1942, only one survived to see Germany again. Hans Becker died January 8, 1943, from infection following the amputation of his gangrenous leg, having refused his own request that his brothers end his suffering mercifully, dying instead with the dignity of a man surrounded by brothers who loved him enough to let him die naturally. Ernst Kruger died February 1, 1943, shot in the chest and abdomen during the final defense of the tractor factory ruins, his last words a command to the two survivors to remember their brotherhood and tell the world they had chosen honor over survival. Otto Schmidt died February 15, 1943, from typhus in Krasnogorsk transit camp, 12 days after capture, quoting Schiller with his final breath about joy and divinity and the sanctuary that men build through their loyalty to each other. Klaus Weber survived 9 years of Soviet captivity and returned home in October 1953, the last living witness to a brotherhood forged in hell and maintained against all logic and all odds until only memory remained. 4 men who had chosen brotherhood over survival, 3 who died keeping that choice, 1 who lived to remember them. The wind still blows across the steppe around Volgograd, carrying snow in winter and dust in summer. The river still flows, brown and wide and indifferent to human concerns. The city that arose from the ruins is modern and functional, bearing little physical resemblance to the Stalingrad that existed in 1942. But beneath the surface, in the soil and in the memory and in the soul of the place, Stalingrad remains. The frozen hell has thawed, but its lessons remain frozen in memory, preserved for generations who will hopefully never need to apply them, but who must understand them nonetheless. Because the alternative to remembering is forgetting. And forgetting means condemning future generations to learn the same lessons at the same terrible cost. Klaus Weber understood this. That is why he opened a bakery honoring men who chose brotherhood over survival. That is why he spoke to students about remaining human in inhuman circumstances. That is why he spent 60 years carrying the memory of 3 men who had been his world in the worst place on earth. And that is why, when the last survivor of Stalingrad dies and living memory finally ends, the story will persist. Not as propaganda or mythology, but as truth, as testimony, as evidence that even in absolute darkness, some lights refuse to be extinguished. The last breath of Stalingrad echoes still across decades and continents and generations. It whispers of brotherhood chosen over survival, of promises kept despite impossible circumstances, of men who remained human when everything conspired to make them monsters, of a sergeant who refused to kill his dying brother, of a captain who delivered letters across enemy lines, of a private who opened a bakery to honor the dead. These are the things worth remembering. These are the lessons worth preserving, not the battles or the casualties or the strategic implications, But the fact that in the frozen hell of Stalingrad, some men chose honor, and that choice, more than any military outcome, is what survives. 91,000 German soldiers surrendered at Stalingrad. Only 6,000 returned home. Klaus Weber was one of them. And in a bakery in Munich that still bears the name of a sergeant who died in a factory ruin more than 60 years ago, the memory persists. The promise is kept. The Brotherhood endures, not through monuments or medals, but through the simple act of baking bread at 4 in the morning and remembering that once, in the worst place at the worst time, 4 men chose each other over survival itself. They chose honor over pragmatism. They chose to remain human when everything argued for becoming something less. That choice, more than any tactical maneuver or strategic decision, is what made them soldiers worth remembering. That choice, repeated by thousands of men on both sides who face similar decisions, is what elevates Stalingrad from mere military history to human testament.